Margaret Whitmore had spent her life cultivating an empire built on hard work, strategy, and an unerring ability to read people. As the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, she had earned her place among the world's most successful business leaders. Her instincts, honed over decades of negotiations and deals, rarely failed her. But when it came to her son, Ethan, her usually sharp intuition was clouded by a mother's protectiveness. Ethan had always been her pride and joy. From the moment he took his first steps, Margaret had seen in him the potential for greatness. He had inherited her determination and drive, excelling in school, and seamlessly stepping into a leadership role within the family business. By the time he turned 30, Ethan was managing some of Whitmore Enterprises' most lucrative projects, earning respect, not just because of his name, but because of his results. But Margaret knew that Ethan's greatest strength, his trusting nature, was also his greatest weakness. He had a big heart, one that often led him to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Margaret had witnessed this trait backfire before, particularly in Ethan's personal life. Past relationships had ended in heartbreak, with women who seemed more interested in his bank account than his personality. Margaret feared that history was repeating itself. When Ethan introduced Sophia Lane, his fiancée, Margaret had been polite but reserved. Sophia was undeniably beautiful, with her sparkling eyes and warm smile. She had a magnetic charm, the kind that could light up a room. Ethan seemed happier than Margaret had seen him in years, and for that, she was grateful. But beneath her gracious exterior, Margaret couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. Sophia's background added to Margaret's unease. She came from a modest family and worked as an event planner, a career that Margaret respected, but found uncomfortably adjacent to the world of wealth and status. Margaret had done her research. She always did. Sophia had built a solid reputation in her field, but Margaret couldn't shake the suspicion that her sudden romance with Ethan might be more calculated than genuine. Margaret's doubts deepened during a family dinner celebrating the engagement. Ethan had invited Sophia to their sprawling estate, and while Sophia was polite and engaging, Margaret noticed small details that set off alarm bells. The way Sophia's eyes lingered on the expensive artwork in the dining room, her curiosity about the value of the family's assets, these were subtle signs, but Margaret had learned to trust her instincts. As the evening progressed, Sophia mentioned her admiration for Ethan's lifestyle. "You have such an incredible life, Ethan," she said, her tone light but earnest. "It must be amazing to wake up every day knowing you've built so much." Ethan laughed, brushing off the compliment. "It's not just me, it's my mom. She's the real powerhouse." Sophia turned to Margaret with a radiant smile. "You must be so proud of Ethan. It's clear he's learned so much from you." Margaret nodded, her smile polite. "He's always been a hard worker," she replied, "but I've always taught him to value the things that can't be bought, character, integrity, and love." Sophia's expression faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Of course," she said quickly. "Those are the most important things. To anyone else, the moment might have seemed insignificant. But to Margaret, it was another piece of the puzzle." That night, as she sat in her study sipping a glass of wine, Margaret replayed the evening's events in her mind. She wanted to believe that Sophia truly loved Ethan for who he was, but the stakes were too high to take that chance. Ethan's future and the legacy of their family depended on it. The next morning, Margaret called Ethan into her office. He arrived with his usual easygoing demeanor, unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's mind. "Mom, what's this about?" he asked, sinking into the leather chair across from her desk. Margaret folded her hands, her expression serious. "I want to talk about Sophia." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What about her?" "I've been watching Ethan," Margaret said carefully. "And while I'm sure Sophia is a wonderful person, I can't shake the feeling that her interest in you might not be entirely genuine." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Mom, we've talked about this. Sophia loves me for who I am. Not for my money, not for the company, just me." "I hope you're right," Margaret replied. "But you've been wrong before." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you're trying to protect me, but you have to trust me on this. Sophia isn't like the others." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. I want to trust you, Ethan, but as your mother, and as someone who's seen what greed can do to people, I need to be sure. If Sophia is truly the one for you, she'll pass any test. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I'm saying that I want to see Sophia for who she really is, not as your fiancée, but as a person. Ethan shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. You're overthinking this, Mom. Sophia doesn't need to prove herself to you. I'm not asking for her to prove anything to me, Margaret said firmly. I want her to prove it to herself, and to you. After Ethan left, Margaret began to formulate a plan. She wasn't interested in confrontation or outright deception. Instead, she wanted to observe Sophia in an environment where money, status, and appearances didn't matter. An idea began to take shape in her mind, an unorthodox but effective way to get the answers she needed. Margaret decided to go undercover as a maid in her own household, blending into the background to see how Sophia treated those she believed to be beneath her. If she's genuine, Margaret thought, her kindness and character will shine through. If not, it'll be clear soon enough. The plan was risky, but Margaret was willing to take the chance. For her son's future, no measure seemed too extreme. Margaret Whitmore was no stranger to taking calculated risks, but her latest plan felt like the boldest one yet. Transforming herself from the billionaire matriarch of Whitmore Enterprises into an unassuming maid would require not only careful planning, but also a significant shift in her demeanor and presentation. It was an idea so unconventional that it almost made her laugh, but Margaret knew that seeing Sophia in an unfiltered light was worth the effort. She began by assembling her team of trusted confidants, her personal assistant Laura and the estate's longtime butler, Mr. Cartwright, both of whom had been with the Whitmore family for decades. Margaret laid out her plan during a private meeting in her study, their reactions a mix of surprise and amusement. You're serious about this? Laura asked, raising an eyebrow. Entirely, Margaret replied. If I'm going to see Sophia for who she truly is, I need to interact with her in a way that removes all pretenses. She can't know it's me. Mr. Cartwright, ever the professional, nodded. It's an unusual approach, madam, but I see your reasoning. How can we assist you? I'll need a disguise, of course, Margaret said, her tone brisk. Something simple but believable. And you'll need to introduce me to the household staff as a temporary maid filling in while one of them is on leave. Laura smirked. You realize this means getting your hands dirty, right? Cleaning, scrubbing, maybe even laundry. Margaret smiled wryly. I'm not above hard work, Laura. Besides, it's only temporary. Over the next few days, Laura and Mr. Cartwright helped Margaret prepare for her new role. Her wardrobe of designer dresses and tailored suits was swapped for plain slacks, button-down shirts, and comfortable sneakers. Her signature jewelry was locked away, and her perfectly coiffed hair was tucked under a simple cap. Laura even helped her practice speaking in a softer, more modest tone, stripping away the authority that usually colored her voice. When Margaret finally looked at herself in the mirror, she was struck by the transformation. Gone was the formidable CEO, in her place stood Maggie, the humble maid. It was a strange feeling, but one that fueled her determination. Perfect, she murmured to herself. Sophia won't suspect a thing. The following Monday, Margaret stepped into her role. Mr. Cartwright introduced her to the rest of the household staff, none of whom were privy to the plan. Everyone, this is Maggie, he said, gesturing to Margaret. She'll be filling in for Mrs. Jensen while she's on leave. Treat her as one of your own. Margaret offered a small, timid smile, playing the part of a new employee eager to prove herself. The staff welcomed her politely, though she could sense a mix of curiosity and skepticism. It wasn't every day that a maid appeared out of nowhere, especially in the tightly run Whitmore household. Sophia arrived at the estate later that day, her usual charm and warmth on full display. Margaret observed her from a distance as she greeted Ethan with a kiss and exchanged pleasantries with the staff. She's good, Margaret thought, but let's see how she behaves when the spotlight isn't on her. Margaret's first interaction with Sophia came when she was assigned to serve lunch in the garden. She approached the couple with a tray of drinks, careful to keep her head slightly bowed and her movements unassuming. "Here you are, ma'am," Margaret said, placing Sophia's glass in front of her. Sophia barely glanced at her, muttering a quick thank you before turning her attention back to Ethan. It wasn't an overt slight, but it was enough to pique Margaret's curiosity. Would Sophia treat her differently when Ethan wasn't around? Margaret didn't have to wait long for an answer. The next day, Sophia spent the afternoon in the sitting room, reviewing wedding plans with a friend. Margaret entered to dust the shelves, keeping her movements quiet and unobtrusive. "I just want the wedding to be perfect," Sophia said, flipping through a glossy magazine. "Ethan deserves the best, and so do I." Her friend chuckled. "You've certainly hit the jackpot with him. He's handsome, successful, and filthy rich. What more could you ask for?" Sophia laughed, the sound light, but tinged with something Margaret couldn't quite place. "It's not just about the money," she said. "Oh, let's be honest, it doesn't hurt." Margaret kept her expression neutral as she dusted, but her ears perked up. Was Sophia joking, or was there truth behind her words? Over the next few days, Margaret continued to observe Sophia closely. She watched how Sophia interacted with the staff, noting every smile, every thank you, and every moment of indifference. While Sophia was generally polite, there were instances that raised red flags. She seemed to lack genuine interest in the people around her, treating them more as background figures than individuals with their own stories. One particularly telling moment occurred when Sophia accidentally spilled a glass of wine during dinner. Margaret, playing her role, hurried to clean up the mess. "I'm so sorry," Sophia said, her tone perfunctory. "Could you get this cleaned up quickly? It's ruining the vibe." Ethan, ever attentive, offered to help, but Sophia waved him off. "That's what the staff is for," she said lightly, though her words left a bitter taste in Margaret's mouth. As the days went on, Margaret began to piece together a more complete picture of Sophia. While she wasn't overtly cruel or disrespectful, there was a subtle entitlement in her behavior that Margaret couldn't ignore. Sophia's interactions with Ethan, however, painted a different picture. She was attentive, affectionate, and seemed genuinely invested in their relationship. Margaret found herself torn. Was Sophia truly in love with Ethan, or was she playing the role of the perfect fiancée to secure her place in the Whitmore family? By the end of the week, Margaret knew it was time to take the next step in her plan. She needed to create a situation that would reveal Sophia's true character, one that couldn't be masked by charm or rehearsed politeness. "I've seen enough to know that something's off," Margaret thought. "Now, it's time to see how she handles a real challenge." Margaret had seen enough to know that Sophia's character wasn't as flawless as she presented to Ethan. Polite on the surface, but occasionally indifferent or dismissive, Sophia's behavior left Margaret questioning whether her affection for Ethan was genuine or calculated. To uncover the truth, Margaret decided to create a scenario that would push Sophia out of her comfort zone and reveal her true intentions. The opportunity presented itself when Sophia mentioned her plans to host a charity gala at the estate, a grand event to raise funds for a children's hospital. Margaret decided to use the event as the backdrop for a test. If Sophia truly cared about others, especially those less fortunate, this would be the moment to prove it. The day of the gala, Margaret worked alongside the household staff to prepare for the event. As Maggie the maid, she stayed in the background, setting tables, arranging flowers, and ensuring everything was perfect. Sophia, in her element as hostess, floated through the preparations with an air of authority, delegating tasks and offering occasional compliments to the staff. "Make sure the centerpieces are flawless," Sophia instructed one of the decorators. "And Maggie, could you polish the silverware again? I noticed a smudge on one of the forks." "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied, her tone humble. She watched as Sophia turned back to Ethan, laughing at something he said and leaning into his shoulder. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple. As the evening progressed, the estate filled with well-dressed guests, including prominent figures from business, entertainment, and philanthropy. Margaret stayed close, observing Sophia's interactions. She was charming and engaging, effortlessly commanding attention and praise. Guests marveled at her poise and generosity, and Ethan beamed with pride. But Margaret noticed the small cracks in Sophia's facade. She paid less attention to guests who weren't wealthy or influential, focusing her energy on those who could elevate her own status. When one of the caterers accidentally spilled a glass of champagne on her dress, Sophia's reaction was swift and cutting. "Are you blind?" she snapped, stepping back in disgust. "This is designer. Do you know how much this costs?" The young caterer stammered an apology, his face red with embarrassment. Before Margaret could step in, Ethan arrived, his expression concerned. "It's just a dress, Sophia," he said gently. "It's not a big deal." Sophia forced a smile, smoothing her tone. "Of course, darling. I was just startled." But as Ethan turned away, Margaret caught the flash of irritation in Sophia's eyes. The final test came later that evening, orchestrated by Margaret herself. She arranged for one of the caterers to pretend to be a struggling single parent who had accidentally misplaced an important donation check meant for the charity. The caterer approached Sophia, explaining the situation with an air of desperation. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling. "I think I might have dropped the check somewhere, but I can't find it. Please don't tell my boss. I really need this job." Sophia's response was immediate and harsh. "You lost a donation check," she said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how irresponsible that is? Do you know what kind of impression that leaves on these donors? Honestly, if you can't handle the pressure, maybe you shouldn't be working events like this." The caterer looked down, her eyes filling with tears. Margaret, standing nearby, stepped forward. "Maybe we can help her look for it," she suggested, keeping her tone neutral. "It's an honest mistake." Sophia barely glanced at her. "There's no time for that, Maggie. Just make sure the rest of the staff is on their best behavior." After the gala ended, Margaret retired to her room, her mind racing with what she had seen. Sophia's true colors had come through in moments of stress and pressure, and they weren't flattering. While she excelled at maintaining appearances, her treatment of people she considered beneath her revealed a lack of empathy and kindness. The next morning, Margaret called Ethan into her office. He arrived looking relaxed and happy, no doubt pleased with how the gala had gone. "You wanted to see me, Mom?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said, her expression serious. "I want to talk to you about Sophia." Ethan frowned, sensing the gravity of her tone. "What about her?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I've been observing her closely, Ethan. I needed to see for myself if she's the right person for you. And I'm not convinced she is." Ethan's face darkened. "What are you talking about?" "Sophia loves me. She's everything I've ever wanted." "Ethan," Margaret said gently but firmly, "there's more to love than charm and beauty. I've seen how she treats people when she thinks no one is watching. She lacks the empathy and humility that you deserve in a partner." Ethan shook his head, his voice rising. "You don't know her like I do. You've been testing her, haven't you? That's why you've been acting so strange." "Yes, I have," Margaret admitted. "Because I love you, and I needed to be sure. You're trusting, Ethan, and that's a wonderful quality. But it also makes you vulnerable to people who don't have your best interests at heart." Ethan stood, torn between anger and disbelief. "This isn't fair," he said. "You can't judge her based on a few moments." "I can judge her based on patterns," Margaret countered. "And those patterns suggest she's more interested in your lifestyle than in you." Ethan left the room without another word. But Margaret knew the seed of doubt had been planted. She had given him the truth. What he did with it was up to him. Ethan left his mother's office feeling a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, and a gnawing doubt that he couldn't shake. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about Sophia. He wanted to dismiss his mother's concerns as paranoia, but the sincerity in her tone and the weight of her observations made it impossible to ignore. That evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse apartment, where Sophia was waiting for him. She greeted him with her usual warmth, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to fully reciprocate. As they sat down to dinner, Sophia noticed his unease. "You seem quiet," she said, tilting her head. "Is everything okay?" Ethan hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "I had a conversation with my mom today," he said finally. She's worried about us?" Sophia's smile faltered. "Worried about us? Why?" She thinks you might be more interested in my money and status than in me, Ethan said, his voice strained. She's been observing you closely. Sophia's eyes widened in shock. What? Ethan, that's ridiculous. I love you for who you are, not what you have. I can't believe she would think that. She's not doing it to hurt us, Ethan said quickly. She's trying to protect me. And honestly, some of the things she pointed out have me questioning things, too. Sophia's expression hardened, her initial shock giving way to defensiveness. What exactly has she been observing? Ethan hesitated again, reluctant to go into detail. She thinks you're not always kind to people, especially those you consider beneath you. Like the staff at the estate. Sophia scoffed, crossing her arms. So now I'm being judged for how I interact with the staff? That's absurd, Ethan. I've always been polite to everyone. Have you? Ethan asked, his voice quieter but firm. Sophia, I've seen moments where you've been dismissive, even rude. And now, after talking to my mom, I can't ignore them anymore. The conversation grew more heated, with Sophia vehemently defending herself, and Ethan trying to navigate his growing doubts. By the end of the night, they were at an impasse. Sophia accused Margaret of meddling and manipulating Ethan, while Ethan admitted that he wasn't sure if their relationship was built on the foundation he had believed it was. I need time to think, Ethan said, standing up and pacing the room. I need to figure out what's real. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. Take all the time you need. But just know that I've always loved you, Ethan. That hasn't changed. The next day, Ethan returned to the estate to confront his mother. He found her in the garden, pruning roses with her usual precision. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm but expectant. Have you thought about what I said? Margaret asked, setting down her shears. I have, Ethan replied, his voice tight. And I'm angry, Mom. Angry that you felt the need to test Sophia like this. It feels like you don't trust me to make my own decisions. Margaret met his gaze, her expression softening. Ethan, it's not about trust. It's about ensuring that you're surrounded by people who love you for the right reasons. I've seen what happens when money clouds relationships. I didn't want that for you. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know you're trying to protect me, but this feels invasive. Like you went behind my back. I did, Margaret admitted, and I understand why you're upset. But tell me this. Did anything I said resonate with you? Did it make you question anything? Ethan hesitated, his silence answering her question. Over the next few weeks, Ethan distanced himself from both Sophia and Margaret, needing time to process his emotions. He replayed his interactions with Sophia in his mind, scrutinizing moments he had once overlooked. The way she had reacted to the spilled champagne, her comments about the lifestyle they shared, her occasional impatience with the staff, it all began to form a pattern he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Margaret gave Ethan the space he needed, confident that he would come to the right decision on his own. She loved her son deeply, but she knew this was a choice he had to make for himself. One evening, Ethan invited Sophia to dinner at a quiet restaurant. It was their first meeting since their argument, and the atmosphere was tense. After some small talk, Ethan took a deep breath and looked into Sophia's eyes. Sophia, he began, I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about our future, and I've come to realize that I don't think we're right for each other. Sophia's face fell, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ethan, no. Don't do this. We can work through whatever doubts you have. It's not just doubts, Ethan said gently. It's about who we are as people. I love you, but I need to be with someone whose values align with mine. Someone who treats everyone with kindness and respect, no matter their position. Sophia shook her head, her voice breaking. I can change, Ethan. I can be better. I don't want you to change for me, Ethan said firmly. I want you to be true to yourself, and I need to do the same. The breakup was painful but necessary. Ethan returned to the estate that night, feeling both heartbroken and relieved. Margaret was waiting for him in the sitting room, her expression a mix of concern and understanding. I ended it, Ethan said simply, sinking into the couch. You were right, Mom. She wasn't the one. Margaret sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. I know that wasn't easy, Ethan, but I'm proud of you for following your instincts and standing by your values. Ethan nodded, his eyes heavy with emotion. I just want to find someone who loves me for me. You will, Margaret said softly. And when you do, you'll know it's real. In the weeks following the breakup, Ethan focused on rebuilding his sense of self. Though the end of his engagement was painful, it also felt like a weight had been lifted. He found solace in his work at Whitmore Enterprises, throwing himself into projects that reignited his passion for business and innovation. It was a welcome distraction, but more importantly, it reminded him of who he was outside of a relationship. Margaret, relieved that Ethan had made the decision on his own terms, gave him the space to heal. She continued her role as both mother and mentor, offering quiet support whenever he needed it. They spent more time together in the weeks that followed, sharing meals, taking walks in the garden, and discussing everything from business strategies to their shared hopes for the future. I'm sorry if I overstepped, Margaret said one evening as they walked along the estate's winding paths. I only wanted to protect you, but I know I can be intense. Ethan smiled, his hands in his pockets. You were right, Mom. I didn't want to see it at first, but you saw things I couldn't. I appreciate that, even if your methods were a bit unorthodox. Margaret chuckled. Unorthodox is a kind way of putting it, but I'm glad you understand. I just want you to be happy, Ethan. I know, Ethan said, his voice filled with gratitude. And I will be. I just need to figure out what that looks like. Ethan's journey of self-discovery wasn't just about moving on from Sophia, it was about redefining his priorities. For years, he had chased success and love without fully understanding what he wanted from either. Now, with a clearer perspective, he began focusing on what truly mattered to him: authenticity, connection, and purpose. One afternoon, while visiting one of Whitmore Enterprises' community projects, Ethan met Claire Jennings, a volunteer coordinator overseeing a housing initiative for underprivileged families. Claire was warm, grounded, and refreshingly candid. She spoke passionately about her work, her eyes lighting up as she described the impact of the program on the community. Ethan was immediately drawn to her sincerity. Unlike the polished and carefully curated personas he was used to encountering in his social circles, Claire was unapologetically herself. She didn't care about his last name or his wealth. She cared about the work they were doing and the lives they were changing. Their connection deepened over the next few months as Ethan found excuses to visit the project more often. He admired Claire's dedication and the way she treated everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of their background. Claire, in turn, appreciated Ethan's genuine interest in the initiative and his willingness to roll up his sleeves and contribute. One day, as they worked side by side painting a community center, Claire turned to Ethan with a curious smile. I have to admit, I didn't expect the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises to be so hands-on. Ethan laughed, wiping a streak of paint from his cheek. I've spent a lot of time behind a desk. It's nice to actually see the impact we're making. Well, you're good at it, Claire said, her tone sincere. You're not just here for the photo op. That means a lot. Her words struck a chord with Ethan. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone truly saw him, not as a billionaire or a CEO, but as a person. As their friendship blossomed into something more, Ethan took a cautious but hopeful approach. He confided in Margaret, who listened with a knowing smile. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Margaret said. But remember, Ethan, it's not about who impresses me. It's about who makes you happy. She does, Ethan admitted. I feel like I can be myself around her. It's different. Then hold on to that, Margaret said. The right person will love you for who you are, flaws and all. Ethan and Claire's relationship grew naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values. They supported each other's dreams, challenged each other to grow, and found joy in the simplicity of being together. Claire was unlike anyone Ethan had ever been with. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or his status, but by his kindness and integrity. Margaret, too, grew to admire Claire. When Ethan brought her to the estate for dinner, Margaret observed her closely, but without the skepticism she had shown Sophia. Claire's warmth and humility were genuine, and the way she spoke about her work revealed a depth of character that Margaret deeply respected. After dinner, Margaret pulled Ethan aside. "She's wonderful," she said simply. "I can see why you care for her." Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. "She's everything I didn't know I was looking for." As their relationship progressed, Ethan began to imagine a future with Claire, one that was rooted in love, trust, and shared purpose. He took his time, wanting to ensure that their bond was as strong as it felt. Claire, too, approached their relationship with the same care, valuing the authenticity they had built together. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of Ethan's penthouse, looking out at the city lights, Ethan took Claire's hand. "I've been through a lot to get here," he said, his voice steady, "but I finally feel like I've found what I've been searching for. And that's you." Claire smiled, her eyes shining. "I feel the same way, Ethan. You've shown me that real love isn't about what someone has, it's about who they are." In Claire, Ethan found the partner he had always needed, someone who loved him for his heart, not his fortune. And in Ethan, Claire found a man who valued her for her passion, kindness, and strength. Together, they built a life filled with purpose, leaving behind the superficiality of the past and embracing the beauty of true connection.